Good evening from Westminster. On the day Boris Johnson has been chosen as the new Prime Minister. As expected, he won convincingly with 2/3 of Tory party members voting for him against his opponent Jeremy Hunt. It is just 3 years since he stepped down as Mayor of London after almost a decade in charge of the capital, leaving behind divided opinion over his legacy. Well, now he must find a way to unite a divided party and a divided country to deliver Brexit. Our political correspondent Simon Harris has the latest.
Boris Johnson has waited an entire lifetime for this moment. He could afford to hang on a few more minutes for some clunky choreography. In truth, he already knew the crown was his, but with his father, sister and brother behind him, his one-time City Hall Chief of Staff Ed Lister beside him, the former mayor sat patiently through the formal announcement.
Jeremy Hunt, 46,656. Boris Johnson, 92,153. And therefore I give notice that Boris Johnson is elected as the leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party.
With that, the Conservatives got a new leader, and tomorrow the country will get a new Prime Minister. Mr Johnson's first words were praise for his opponent and inevitably a joke.
You've been friendly, you've been good-natured, you've been a font of excellent ideas, all of which I propose to steal forthwith.
Even the serious stuff, his mission statement, came with a punchline.
I know some wag has already pointed out that deliver, unite and defeat was not the perfect acronym for an election campaign, since unfortunately it spells dud. But they forgot the final E, my friends, E for energise. And I say to all the doubters, dude, we are going to energise the country. We're going to get Brexit done on October the 31st. We're going to take advantage of all the opportunities that it will bring in a new spirit of can-do.
In the end, Mr Johnson beat his rival comprehensively, winning 2/3 of the vote of Tory party members.
He's got optimism, enthusiasm, he puts a smile on people's face, and he has total, unshakable confidence in our amazing country. And that is a quality that we need. And, we've got some challenges ahead, but Boris has got that confidence, and I think he'll do a great job.
The man who replaced him at City Hall knows he needs to work with the new PM, but Brexit could be a barrier.
I disagree with him passionately about his views in relation to Brexit. I think he's wrong in relation to a no-deal Brexit. I worry about our city in relation to jobs, in relation to growth, in relation to prosperity.
7 years ago, Justine Greening was Transport Secretary when Boris Johnson was Mayor. Together, they switched on the tunnelling machines to begin work on Crossrail. In those days, they were on the same side. But today, she fired a Brexit warning shot in his direction.
Parliament has voted against crashing out with no deal. I think we'll continue to do that, and I find it inconceivable that Boris, as an incoming Prime Minister, could seek to try and override the will of Parliament. It clearly wouldn't be right.
Even some of his closest relatives think he's wrong about Brexit. But for today at least, the Johnson clan put family loyalty first. Simon Harris, ITV News.
Well, for better or for worse, London's skyline is very different now as a result of Boris Johnson's 8 years as mayor. There is the cable car across the river in East London, criticised as a vanity project. The Olympic Park in Stratford stands as a legacy to London 2012. Some people credit Mr Johnson with a surge of skyscrapers across the city. And there is, of course, no garden bridge across the river at Temple, despite more than £40 million of taxpayers' money being spent. Well, our political correspondent Simon Harris is here. So, Simon, what can we learn from Boris Johnson's legacy as mayor? What kind of a Prime Minister will this make, you think?
Lucrezia, when Boris Johnson launched his campaign to be Tory leader, he argued that his 8 years at City Hall proved he was Prime Minister material. His critics, of course, argue it proves precisely the opposite. But it's fair to say that after 8 years at City Hall, we have got some clues about how he works, and we can see what he might be like. And among those who followed his activities closely, it's fair to say he divides opinion. Londoners don't have to look far to find reminders of Boris Johnson's 8 years in City Hall. There are monuments like the Orbit Tower. the new Routemaster bus with its promise of a hop-on, hop-off platform at the back, and a cable car over the Thames, currently used by fewer than 30,000 people every week. I took a ride with Caroline Pidgeon, a former chair of the London Assembly Transport Committee.
Well, we're in Boris Johnson's cable car, one of his many vanity projects that he brought in as Mayor of London. Hardly anyone uses it, but Transport for London money went into this, as well as, interestingly, some European money as well.
What do you think of it?
Well, what is it? Is it supposed to be a mode of transport? Is it supposed to be a tourist attraction? It's somewhere in between, and it doesn't really work either way.
The Olympic Games gave Boris Johnson a platform on the world stage. For better or for worse, the photo opportunities went global.
Can you get me a rope?
In the summer of 2012, Boris Johnson was London's cheerleader-in-chief, and his supporters argue that figurehead role defined his City Hall years. James Cleverly was a Conservative member of the London Assembly.
One of the things he did, one of the first things he did, was to introduce a whole load of energy into London government. And that meant enthusing about the business sector. It also meant taking knife crime and violence seriously, about pitching for transport investment. He was a real advocate for London and Londoners.
On the bank of the River Thames is another Johnson legacy, or rather there isn't. This is where the Garden Bridge was meant to be built. The project was scrapped after the Labour MP Margaret Hodge carried out an audit for the current mayor.
They promised they would deliver it with no public money at all. They ended up with a project which I think would have cost £200 million and in the process wasted £46 million of public money.
Even his critics concede he's not all bad. What was his greatest strength?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. Boris could, I guess, maybe bring some people together. He was a great joker, so at times that worked.
What's his biggest weakness?
Well, I mean, we all have weaknesses. I think he's a great communicator. That's one of his strengths. But when you've produced millions of words, both written and spoken, in your political career, there will always be some amongst those that will trip people up.
Can he be a good Prime Minister?
Well, you've always got to give a guy a chance, and you've got to judge him on his record, but I think his record as Mayor of London demonstrates to me that somebody who's very narcissistic, thinks about himself, and I'm not sure he will really put the nation's interest above his personal profile.
We're about to find out. It promises to be an interesting ride.
Before London's former mayor takes up residence in one of the capital's most famous addresses, number 10 Downing Street. Well, Simon is back now. Simon, divided opinion on Boris Johnson. You can hear it here where we are, some very loud noises going on, but also on his mayoralty and what he did for London. What do you think he's going to be like as a Prime Minister?
I don't think the jury's even been sworn in yet. It's far too early to say. As far as businesses in London are concerned, it all depends on Brexit. They certainly don't want a no deal by and large, nor does Sadiq Khan. Now, in the past, the mayor has been quite scathing about his predecessor's record, but he didn't go for the jugular today, in part, I suspect, because he knows he has to establish a working relationship with the new Prime Minister. He certainly wants Boris Johnson on side in the war against knife crime. Of course, there are other issues that the former mayor needs to address as far as London's concerned. What will he do about pollution and air quality? Will he perform a U-turn on Heathrow and allow a third runway to be built? Will he allow HS2 to go ahead despite what appear to be escalating costs? And what about Crossrail? If, as is entirely possible, it's going to cost even more money, will he sanction yet another taxpayers' bailout?
Simon, so many questions. Some busy weeks ahead for you, I think. Thank you very much. Well, we will be back here tomorrow when Boris Johnson is officially Prime Minister. But for now, I'll hand you back over to Geraint in the studio. Good evening from Downing Street, which now has a new occupant. He's in there right now. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, gave his first speech outside the doors of number 10 behind me just a little earlier after meeting with the Queen. Well, as he made his way to Buckingham Palace, climate change protesters that have done so much this summer to disrupt the lives of Londoners made sure the incoming Prime Minister got a taste of it too, as our political correspondent Simon Harris reports.
Britain's new Prime Minister faces many obstacles, but this one took everyone by surprise. Ambush in the Mall. Boris Johnson's armoured Jag and police escort was brought to a standstill as climate change protesters linked hands. One officer ran from his motorbike and herded 3 of them out of the way. The convoy was quickly on its way again to the palace, but this was an embarrassing security breach. And then, the moment London's former mayor finally achieved his long-held ambition, the moment he was invited by the Queen to form a government. In Downing Street, his partner Carrie Symonds was waiting with some of the new team at number 10. Boris Johnson's first speech as Prime Minister was of a vintage familiar to many Londoners.
The doubters, the doomsters, the gloomsters, they are going to get it wrong again.
His first priority was Brexit.
I have every confidence that in 99 days' time we will have cracked it. But you know
then
what?
came the policy promises.
My job is to make your streets safer. And we're going to go in with another 20,000 police on the streets, and we start recruiting forthwith.
Not far from Westminster, Prime Minister Johnson was occupying the thoughts of a group of students in Brixton. They're all politically aware and politically active, and yet to be convinced.
It's interesting to see him change a bit. I don't know if anyone else has noticed, he looks more put together and less dishevelled than when he was Mayor of London, at least.
Based on his history as Foreign Secretary in particular, and his catalogue of errors and sort of buffoonery, essentially, I don't really think he's fit to hold the highest office in the land.
If we do indeed go ahead with Brexit, which is a big shame for my generation, I believe that the onus is on Boris Johnson and the Tory party to make sure that the trade deals we secure are beneficial to our country.
What does he need to do to convince you?
Stop Brexit. And then maybe. Yeah.
Boris Johnson was also uppermost in the minds of MPs as they questioned Theresa May for the last time.
So how does she feel about handing over to a man who, among many things, is happy to demonise Muslims, is prepared to chuck our loyal public servants and diplomats under a bus, and promises to sell our country out to Donald Trump and his friends?
I am pleased to hand over to an incoming leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister, who I worked with when he was in my cabinet.
But the spikiest exchanges were between the outgoing Prime Minister and Jeremy Corbyn.
Doesn't she agree the best thing the Right Honourable Member for Uxbridge could do later on today, when he takes office, is to call a general election and let the people decide their future?
As a party leader who has accepted when her time was up, perhaps the time is now for him to do the same.
Mrs May was given a standing ovation, but not by Labour. This, however, wasn't her final appearance as PM. A short time later, she was saying goodbye outside number 10. Politics at this level is not for the squeamish. There are no niceties in the handover of power as one Prime Minister is evicted and a new tenant moves in.
Well, Simon joins me now. And Simon, we've had a flurry of activity, haven't we, in the last half an hour? We've just seen Dominic Raab, I think, going in. What do we know about the team that Boris Johnson is building around him already?
Well, the clear-out of the Cabinet's already beginning. He spent some of this afternoon in the House of Commons sacking those ministers he doesn't want to inherit. Others have decided to jump. The most high-profile, the Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, the South West Surrey MP. He's decided to go back to the back benches. He was offered another job but didn't want it. Also out as resignation is Chris Grayling, who is the MP for Epsom and Ewell, but is also the Transport Secretary, responsible for HS2, for Crossrail, for Heathrow Airport. And we've also seen the disappearance of James Brokenshire, the Housing and Community Secretary. He too has resigned. The Old Bexley and Sidcup MP has decided to go back to the back benches. He was responsible, of course, for Grenfell. Behind the scenes, we've got a glimpse of some of the team that Boris Johnson's taking from City Hall. When his girlfriend was outside with those advisors, I noticed 3 from his old City Hall team: Will Walden, his ex-director of communications, Ben Gascoigne, who was his private secretary at City Hall, and Sir Ed Lister, who's his chief of staff.
All right, Simon, a busy night ahead for Boris Johnson, we think. For now, thank you. Back to our main story of the day, the transfer of power. Boris Johnson is now officially the Prime Minister. He's been to see the Queen and has made his inaugural speech as PM on the steps of Downing Street right behind me. Simon is back. Simon, you followed Boris Johnson closely when he was Mayor of London. This is a very different platform, a much bigger platform. What did you make of his speech today?
What I made of it was a very Boris Johnson speech. I felt I could have been listening to any one of dozens of speeches he made as Mayor over his 8 years at City Hall. There were what you might call the rhetorical flourishes in there, the one-liners, that never mind the backstop, the buck stops here. Of course, what we want to know is what the flesh is behind the rhetoric. There are two particular policy promises that Londoners will be interested in, that 20,000 extra police officers. How many of those will go to the Met? Will it redress the balance of the cuts? And also a promise to enable millions of young people to become homeowners. How is he going to make that happen? We know that he's carrying out a ruthless cut of of the old cabinet. He was welcomed inside Downing Street earlier by cheering applause from the new staff. But at the moment, all eyes are on his new cabinet.
Yeah, there will be cheering from the staff. Also, some crowds not liking him too much out there. Simon,
as we can hear.
We can hear. Thank you so much.
So welcome to Primrose Hill and what has ended up being the second hottest day ever recorded in Britain. On the other side of town, in Kew Gardens, it has hit 37.9 degrees Celsius, a wasp flying around me there. As you can see, it's not quite as sunny here now, although there are pockets of sunshine out and about. I think the sun was just over Vauxhall a couple of minutes ago. But many didn't necessarily realise just how brutal the intense heat would be, or how disruptive. Hundreds of commuters are stuck on trains as we speak after trackside fires. Thousands more are stuck in London waiting after long delays, as Simon Harris reports.
Commuters were warned it would be bad, and it was. In North London, passengers had to be helped from one train to another when the Thameslink line ground to a halt at West Hampstead, just in time for tonight's rush hour. A fire had broken out next to the tracks, damaging vital cables. At King's Cross, the heatwave was causing a different kind of problem. The tracks were getting too hot and rail bosses feared they might buckle.
Please note that services are subject to delay because of severe weather.
We've needed to cancel about 25% of our services. Mostly that's been King's Cross to Peterborough, where the speed restrictions are in place.
As the temperature rose, station staff handed out bottles of water, and paramedics patrolled the concourse and platforms looking for passengers about to keel over.
They're used to seeing people who might just look a bit unsteady on their feet. So people who are sweating profusely can sometimes be somebody you might want to help. And of course the railway staff are also alerting us to people who have asked for assistance.
It was bad enough above ground, but the real furnace was the underground.
I feel like if you don't get enough oxygen or enough water, you feel like you could faint.
While some parts of the tube are unbearable, the subsurface lines like the District and Circle are a refreshing oasis of cool. That's because the trains are air-conditioned. On a day like today, it's almost worth taking a ride, simply to cool down. Gretchen de Soriano jumped on at Cannon Street after a journey on an overheated train from Catford.
As I was sitting there, sweat was pouring off of my face. I've never been so hot. And the woman across from me was from India, and she says it doesn't get this hot there.
Cooling off was the holy grail for millions of us today. Close to Tower Bridge, these ornamental fountains came into their own. Some Londoners headed for the nearest outdoor pool, but at Brockwell Lido there was no such thing as a quick dip. They queued and queued and queued. The irresistible lure of water has led to 2 people drowning in the Thames this week. Today the authorities pleaded with swimmers not to put their lives at risk.
The tides are extremely fast. In fact, they're twice as fast as Olympic swimmers able to swim. So that makes them particularly dangerous.
It was no fun being a market trader in this heat, especially if you were trying to sell fish.
We need to use a lot of ice, and also, the customers tend not to get out to buy fish.
Shoppers did what they could to take the sting out of the heat wave.
In my country, it's hot, but not this hot.
Where's your country?
Hot. Pakistan.
It's hotter than Pakistan here?
Yeah, today it's hotter than Pakistan.
What do you do to keep cool?
I'll go into the shops and stand under the AC. And that's it.
The heat? Oh, I love it. Yeah, because you have it today, you may not get it tomorrow.
And for many Londoners, that was the mantra. Enjoy it while it lasts. But for tens of thousands of commuters tonight, the heatwave has brought nothing but misery. Simon Harris, ITV News.